Vast flocks of passenger pigeons used to darken the skies of North America. Then they were gone. How did humans trigger the extinction of the passenger pigeon and other birds? Scientists are hunting for evidence in diverse environments to understand bird populations. Join us now for a conversation with ornithologist Dr. Helen James to analyze what makes birds vulnerable to extinction. Now, here's your host, Maggie Benson.
Hi, thanks for joining us. I'm Maggie Benson, host of Smithsonian Science How. We're so happy that you're here joining us for another episode. And we're really excited to bring to you today ornithologist and paleontologist from the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History, Dr. Helen James. Thanks for joining us, Helen.
Very happy to be here, Maggie, and glad to know the students have tuned in today, too.
Absolutely. So, Helen, you're a paleontologist and an ornithologist. Can you tell us how those two relate?
Well, an ornithologist is someone who studies birds, very simple. And I think most people know what a paleontologist is. That's someone who studies fossils. So I study fossil birds.
And how do those two go hand in hand? Are you looking at birds that are obviously very old?
You know, there are some very famous, really ancient fossil birds that go back to the age of dinosaurs. Those aren't the ones that I focus my research on. I actually study fossils of modern type birds. So birds, I'm studying birds in what we call the Quaternary period of time.
How long ago does that go?
Well, it starts with the Pleistocene about 2.5 million years ago, and then comes up through the Holocene, which is about the last 10,000 years. And honestly, most of the extinctions of birds that I study have happened very recently in that period of time. So they've happened only in the time since people have been present in the world's ecosystems.
So you're looking at the extinction of birds, and how does that better help you understand bird populations today?
Well, I'm studying the history of extinction of modern birds in relation to human ecological impacts, especially on islands, but also on continents. And by studying extinctions that have happened because of ecological change caused by humans in the recent past, we may be able to better protect species going forward from further extinctions.
How interesting. So I know that there was a big anniversary. The extinction of the passenger pigeon just marked 100 years. Do you do any research on that, or is that an example of a human-influenced extinction?
This is a prime example this year, and a lot of people are thinking about bird extinctions because this is the 100-year anniversary of the extinction of the passenger pigeon. And we have the actual last individual to have lived of the passenger pigeon is a mounted specimen that belongs to the Smithsonian. She's on exhibit this year. You can see her in the lobby of the Natural History Museum.
And that's Martha.
And that's Martha. She died in the Cincinnati Zoo on September the 1st, 1914. And she was a celebrity at that time because she was the last living member of what had been the most abundant species of North American bird, if not the most abundant species of bird in the world.
The most abundant bird in the world?
Only 50 to 100 years before that.
So if that was the most abundant bird in the world, can you tell us a little bit about their life history, their natural history? What kind of birds were they?
Absolutely. And I just want to mention, too, that we have an example of a passenger pigeon here. So you can see what they looked like. And this is a male and has this beautiful rusty iridescence. And the female was duller. But these birds traveled. They were perhaps the most social species of bird ever. They traveled in enormous flocks. They migrated in incredible flocks. They roosted in big congregations, and they nested colonially in these huge nesting colonies. Their flocks could have had 1 billion or 2 billion birds in a single flock.
Wow, that's incredible. Yeah. As we're seeing in this recreation here, the sky must have gotten very dark when they passed by.
People who witnessed these flocks, like colonial and pioneer Americans, said that they could hear the thunder of the wings before they even saw the migrating flock. And they would fly over it could take over a day or up to 3 days for one migrating flock to cross the sky. It was just a river of birds. And John James Audubon said it was like an eclipse of the midday sun when these birds flew over.
So it's astonishing to me that a bird that was perhaps the most abundant on Earth could go extinct in such a short period of time.
It is astonishing, and it was astonishing to Americans living at the time that this happened. They had experienced this very abundant species in their lifetimes, and then they witnessed its extinction.
I think we should ask our students what led to their extinction, maybe their vulnerabilities.
Let's find out.
All right. Here's your chance to answer a poll with us today. What made the passenger pigeon vulnerable to extinction? Was it migrating in large groups, nesting in colonies, eating acorns and other tree nuts, raising only one chick per year, or having tasty flesh? Take a moment to think about it and put your answer in the window to the right of your video screen. So Helen, the results are coming in and it looks like we have an even spread across all answers. What do you think?
That's showing that the students have very accurate opinions on this, because in fact this was sort of a trick question. Each of those answers has truth in it. And the birds indeed migrating in these large groups, nesting and roosting in these large groups in particular, made it easy to locate the birds, especially once we had the telegraph to let people know where the flocks were deciding to nest. And then professional hunters could harvest them in great numbers. And back in those days, we didn't have the chicken farms established that we have now. You couldn't just walk into a grocery store and buy a chicken as easily as you can now. So people relied on wild game to quite an extent. And these birds were just piled into railway cars and brought back to the eastern cities in our country.
So they were a primary staple.
They were a very primary staple, and you can find recipes for passenger pigeons in old recipe books.
Wow, that's interesting.
In addition, they raised only one, as far as we know, only one chick per year. So if you did harvest them, it could be hard for the population to recover if you harvested them very heavily. And the reason they were able to nest in such huge congregations is that they fed on nut crops. They fed on acorns, chestnuts, and beech nuts during that breeding period. And those tend to be very concentrated when they have a phenomenon called mast. So across this continuous eastern deciduous forest, only in certain regions would you have a tremendous nut crop. And that's what the birds used for their food. So as we cut down the forest and converted land for agriculture, those continuous forests also were broken up.
So it sounds like there were multiple factors that went into the extinction of the passenger pigeon. Is this extinction event unique, or are there other birds that have similar stories?
We don't really think about it every day, but there are a number of North American birds that colonial and pioneer and earlier Americans experienced as part of the wilderness experience that indeed have gone extinct. And many of these were abundant birds in our native ecosystems. For example, we've spoken of the passenger pigeon, but did you know that just in our area in Washington, D.C., where we're sitting today, when we go in the forest now, we don't really think of encountering a tropical-looking parrot, but this is the Carolina parakeet that used to be, in the eastern deciduous forest. This amazing bird was native to our forests and fields, and it became extinct. The heath hen that we have here,
this tall one,
last occurred on Martha's Vineyard, and it was a popular bird for hunting in the east here.
Again,
but it's also
a staple in a diet.
Another case. And here we have the ivory-billed woodpecker. There's debate about whether this woodpecker is finally extinct or not, but this was the largest woodpecker in our North American fauna, and apparently it is extinct.
And so for these birds to go extinct, is there ever just one reason, or is it a variety of impacts that causes them to go extinct?
That to me is a really compelling question that as a scientist I want to address. It's one of the things that drives my research, because We know that a lot of global change is taking place in the world today, that there is a high rate of extinction, and that there are a high number of birds that are threatened with extinction. And so what I want to study is what really caused the extinctions that have led up to this of the past. What really does cause birds to finally go extinct? And usually, you're right, Maggie, there are a number of forces that could be causing that population decline. And the question for science is to figure out what are the most important ones, what are the most important actions that we need to take then to preserve species now.
So your research is very important. So we have a student question. Are you ready to take it?
Sure, let's take a question.
This one comes from Jeff from Jacksonville. He wants to know, why does it matter if we don't have any passenger pigeons?
One of the reasons it matters is that plants and animals have what we call ecological roles. And the ecological role could be what the bird eats and what ecosystem it lives in and how it interacts with other animals. And if you have an extinction that had been extremely abundant become extinct, then that very major ecological role is missing. And there's no real effective way to restore it. You can try, if you decide that the ecosystem is not functioning the way it used to because of this extinction, you could try to introduce into the ecosystem something with a similar ecological role, but consider the passenger pigeon. There was no other bird on Earth that was like the passenger pigeon. There's nothing we can introduce to restore that role. So that's one reason that losing species is harmful to our ability to keep ecosystems healthy going forward.
Great question, Jeff. Thank you. So, Helen, I know that you do a lot of your research in Hawaii. Why are the Hawaiian Islands a unique landscape for you to do your work?
You know, the Hawaiian Islands are a volcanic archipelago, and they're out in the middle of the world's largest ocean, this incredible barrier to animal dispersal. For animals that live on continents, they have a very hard time arriving in Hawaii across all that salt water. And the islands are volcanic. They are, from their lava that is pushed up through the lithosphere, or the Earth's crust, and is poured out onto the surface of the crust. And finally, this mound of lava breaks the surface of the ocean, and it builds an island. And on the big island of Hawaii, those volcanoes stretch even 3 miles almost above the surface of the ocean. So they're this very rich ecosystem that is nevertheless separated from other terrestrial or ground ecosystems by a vast ocean barrier.
So how do you find fossils, if that's what you study, out in this volcanic landscape?
Paleontologists didn't turn their attention to looking for fossils in the Hawaiian Islands for a long time. In fact, it was in the 1970s that I started looking there with Storrs Olsen and some other important contributors in the Hawaiian Islands. And that was really because who would go look for fossils in volcanoes? What's going to preserve a fossil there? So the first thing we did is we went around the edges of the islands because there you have marine sediments accumulating, old sand dunes, coral reefs that become elevated above sea level. And these are calcium carbonate-based sediments, which are very good for preserving bones. Bones have a lot of calcium in them. So we looked around the edges of the islands, and then we had an insight, and we began going up the slopes of the younger islands where there are lava tube caves, and we found fossils in there, and we were able to sample the whole spectrum of habitat types in the islands by looking in these lava caves.
So these lava tubes, what are they like? How are you finding fossils in these tubes that carry hot lava throughout the island?
That's right. The lava tubes are basically the plumbing system of a lava flow. And if you can imagine, there's a volcanic vent up on the slope of the volcano. And lava is coming down, and there's a river, and you've seen these films of a river of lava, and it's, molten lava is red. But you also see that some places on the river, there's a little crust where the lava is starting to cool, and it crusts over. It's already forming rock, and that's black. Well, this pipe brings the lava all the way down to the front of the flow where it spreads out. The vent stops putting out lava. Red stuff drains out of the pipe, and you've got this empty tube.
So how do birds, if you're finding fossils in these empty tubes, how do birds get into them? They're not in lava flows.
Right. So sometimes there are openings into the flow. For instance, where you saw, in the video that there is red lava, there's no crust over that. That lava can just drain out, and you've got this vertical opening into the tube. And birds like an ibis, we'll show you an ibis that we found in a cave, in a lava tube cave. Let's say this ibis was wandering around in the woods. It was very much like a kiwi in its habits, wandering around looking for snails in the woods. It falls into this trap, this
like
cave.
This.
Exactly. This is an artist's depiction of how the ibis could have become preserved in the cave. So the ibis falls in. It's flightless, it's unable to fly. And so it wanders into cave darkness and it passes away there. So thousands of years later, the paleontologists can come along, can use ropes to carefully and gently lower themselves into the cave. And then we find those bones still preserved in the darkness thousands of years later. And actually they can be remarkably preserved. We actually find biological molecules that were part of the living organism still preserved in those bones, like DNA and collagen proteins.
Wow, that's incredible. So how do you picture what this animal looked like if it could be thousands of years old and since extinct? How do you go from knowing from the bones what it looks like?
Well, we study the bones very closely. And for example, you can look at this skull. This is the fossil skull of an ibis from a lava cave. And it has the bill shape, you can kind of pick it out. If you know that an ibis has this big decurved beak, you can really quickly pick out that this must be an ibis skull. But in other cases, it's not so evident what the bird is. So we have a comparative collection here at the Smithsonian of the skeletons of modern birds, which are all identified, and we make very close comparisons of the skeletons of these fossil birds with the modern birds in order to understand what their body forms were like. I mean, another good example is the skull of this bird. This is related to ducks, but it's a big goose-like skull. It had undergone a lot of evolution in the islands, and it had become basically this big, heavy-bodied herbivore, sort of like the native sheep of the islands. And
was this bird also flightless?
This bird was also flightless, and I think we have a skeleton of this bird that we can show you. So an artist that I worked with illustrated each bone very carefully and then rearticulated them in Photoshop to show us what the skeleton looked like. And then afterwards, she put feathers on the bird so that you could get a concept of what this animal might have looked like walking around in the woods.
Interesting. So you've showed us two birds that you've reconstructed that are both flightless. Is there a connection there with flightlessness and extinction on the Hawaiian Islands?
Well, thank you for asking me, because I want to talk about flightlessness. You know, the birds that colonized the Hawaiian Islands had to fly there across, several thousand kilometers of ocean in order to arrive there on these volcanoes. But at least 22 different species in the islands that we've found fossils of became unable to fly through evolution. So their wings became very small. And if you look at that skeleton, the reconstruction that we had of the mo'inalo, you can see it has tiny little wings. And I also want to talk about the sternum. This is the sternum of a goose.
So the breastbone.
Yep, this is the breastbone of a goose. And if we look at this, everybody has seen this bone in a chicken, and you know that this big keel here supports all that wonderful breast muscle that we love to eat. And that breast muscle is what allows the bird to fly. It's the very heavy breast muscle that powers the flapping of the wings. But if we look at the sternum of the moanalo, which is actually a relative of geese, look, the keel is completely missing from this sternum. And so this bird had only a thin sheet of breast muscle, and it had tiny little wings and a great big heavy body, and it was completely unable to get off the ground and fly. So it had basically evolved to fill a mammal-like niche. It had become a terrestrial bird.
So that's interesting that you can tell if a bird is flightless or not by the sternum. But I'm still really curious about this flightless question and the vulnerabilities that may have come with that. What do you think we ask our students? Think we should ask our students this question?
Let's ask them.
All right, wonderful. Why do flightless birds tend to go extinct? They fall into lava tubes, they can't find food on the ground, they can't fly away from predators, their nests are easy targets for predators, or all of the above. So Helen, we had mixed results. What do you think the correct answer was there?
There were some correct answers and some incorrect ones. So the birds didn't go extinct from falling into lava tubes. It's actually very rare for them to do that, and I can assure you the paleontologist has to look far and wide to find a bird that fell into a lava tube. But avoiding predators is one of the main ones, because when people arrive in islands, they often bring mammals, other mammals with them. And mammals like even a small rat that is introduced can be a predator of birds that are nesting on the grounds. They can chew through the eggs, for example. And so the predation rate from things like mongoose and rats and cats can be quite high compared with when these birds evolved flightlessness.
So when humans arrived in the Hawaiian Islands, they brought predators that these animals weren't used to.
That's right.
So did you find any other remains in your research in Hawaii other than flightless birds?
We found an amazing variety of birds, perhaps 60 extinct species of birds in this research. And many of them were flightless birds. There were also raptorial birds like an owl and a hawk that were specially adapted for feeding on birds. And then there were a whole variety of colorful forest birds that became extinct, such as relatives of these Hawaiian honeycreepers.
These are beautiful.
Yeah.
So can you always tell what kind of bird you're finding based on just the bones?
Well, we can tell a lot from the bones, but there's a lot more we can learn from looking at those ancient biomolecules I mentioned that are preserved inside some of these bones.
How do you get to them?
Well, I have wonderful collaborators who work in stable isotope labs or ancient DNA labs or radiocarbon labs who are able to get amazing information out of the bones. We have to sacrifice a little bit of bone for this and powder it up. And it goes through a long laboratory procedure. But then we can use a radiocarbon date to find out when that individual bird died, when in time. We can use stable isotopes, for instance, of carbon and nitrogen, to find out something about its ecology, its habitat, what it ate. And we can use ancient DNA sequences to find out about its evolutionary relationships and also about its past populations.
And don't you use something else that some kids might find very amusing today?
You know, in one of my excavations, we actually found coprolites. And coprolites are a polite term for saying we found ancient turds from this big waterfowl species. And so this is an illustration that you're looking at that shows the actual fossil coprolite next to turds of a Canada goose, which everyone has seen. And we were able to look at plant microfossils inside the turd and find out that these birds indeed were herbivores and they were eating green leafy material, especially ferns. And you know, they were probably actually doing hindgut fermentation like a sheep in order to live off such a diet.
So your research on finding these fossils around the Hawaiian Islands and doing analysis on them using museum collections and laboratory techniques, what have they told you about bird populations in the past on the Hawaiian Islands?
Well, it's a bit of a sad story, Maggie. Tremendous amount of extinction has taken place, and the extinction, based on the radiocarbon dates, apparently took place only after people first arrived in the Hawaiian Islands. And we're looking here at a chart that summarizes the number of endemic species that lived only in the Hawaiian Islands and lived there all year round, of birds that were in that record, when people arrived about 1,000 years ago. And the ones that you see only the white profiles of, those have all become extinct in the human era.
Oh,
only
wow.
the past 1,000 years. And the ones you saw in gray are actually now endangered with extinction, and only those few that have a black outline are still considered safe.
That's a huge amount of extinction. What are some of the direct impacts to these populations that may have caused them to go extinct?
Well, we know of a number of forces of change. There's obviously direct harvesting by people. And for example, this beautiful feather cloak was made by native Hawaiian people. And the birds that produce the yellow and the black feathers are in fact extinct. So we know there was direct harvesting by people of these birds. But that wasn't the main cause of extinction of so many species. It's just hard to drive so many species of birds to extinction. So we also think that introduced predators, that landscape conversion for agriculture, and the introduction later of alien diseases, all these factors have contributed to the extinctions.
So again, it's a variety of factors that are causing declines in bird populations and ultimately extinction in some cases.
And the big question for science when we see a massive extinction like this is to really figure out what the major forces were and try to control for those going forward.
So we're still living in the Hawaiian Islands as humans, and there are still bird populations. Is there any hope for the birds?
There is hope for the birds. So conservation biology is a field that has really grown since the extinction of the passenger pigeon and these other North American species that we spoke of. And it's a very serious science now. And for example, we could use the Hawaii state bird, the nene, which
is what we're seeing here.
Yes, and this species had a very close brush with extinction, and it was only because conservation biologists brought the birds into captivity, figured out how to propagate them, release them back into the wild, that this species has probably escaped extinction. So conservation takes commitment, and it takes effort, but it can happen, it's possible.
And it must also depend on knowing the life histories of these birds and the populations throughout time, which your research is shedding light on.
Bringing forth these records of what the ecosystem had been like before people were in it, and really studying how the ecosystem used to function before now, we're hoping that we can inform conservation efforts and stem the tide of extinctions going forward.
It's been so wonderful learning about your work. Can you tell our viewers where they can learn a little bit more about your work and the Hawaiian birds that we've talked about today?
Sure, there are some resources on the web. There's passengerpigeon.org, which I really recommend for passenger pigeons, and the Curious website at the Smithsonian and other natural history websites also are helpful, and the Bishop Museum in Honolulu is a good resource.
Helen, we are all out of time. Thank you so much for all of your wonderful questions. It's been really a treat learning more about your work as an ornithologist here at the Smithsonian today.
All right, well, it's been a pleasure for me.
If you missed part of this broadcast or want to see it again, it'll be archived later this evening on curious.si.edu. We hope to see you next time on Smithsonian Science How.
Thanks for watching. You can explore more Smithsonian Science How shows on our website, curious.si.edu. We hope you'll join us again on Thursday, January 15th, for a conversation with plant expert Rusty Russell, as we explore how ecosystem changes can be interpreted through plant collections. Register now at curious.si.edu.